So, hello and welcome back. We are back yet again with my attempts to recap a fantastic series and a fantastic final book, and hopefully do it any sort of justice. Yes, indeed, we are back with Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory's The Phoenix Transformed, the final book in the Enduring Flame trilogy. And yeah, that is what we are going to do tonight. We are going to recap another chapter of The Phoenix Transformed. I was looking through it and I think there's only 20 chapters, so we're actually almost halfway done with this book and we're only on chapter 8, which kind of lets you know that these chapters are all pretty dang meaty. They're pretty big chapters. I hope everybody is doing good. I'm cold. It's so silly. It was warm enough yesterday that when I went out for a walk, I saw a snake. Like, I mean, unfortunately, it was a flat snake because somebody had run it over, but I saw a snake, just a little snake in the road. And I was like, okay, it's all pretty much the end of October. That definitely tells you that our weather has been unseasonably warm because some years we already have snow on the ground at this point. Some years we don't. So, it's fine. But it was, I don't know, like 65 yesterday. And then overnight we were supposed to get rain. We got a little bit, not much. And we did get a lovely cold front from our neighbors in Canada, and it has definitely cooled off. In fact, when I went to the mailboxes today, I went out and I realized that pretty much all of the trees lost their leaves last night. Yesterday, when I went for a walk, all of the trees still had all of their little yellow and brown and some red leaves, and today they're gone. We did have a lot of wind last night, but it was very surprising to look around and be like, all the leaves are gone. That's weird. So, yeah. Anyway, we're going to be jumping back in and doing this recap. And in the last chapter, if you remember, Tercel and Chim were attacked by a basically flying scorpion ridden by the demon Aniran, and she also placed a spell on Saravase, Chim's dragon, so that anybody who casts any magic on Saravase will open up a channel to allow her to taint them. She did that because she wants to make a new race of demons, and that seems like probably a really good plan if she wants Bisochim. Um, Harrier and all of the Isvani are leaving the Lake of Fire and trying to get back at least to the regular desert. They're trying to get out of the Barileth, which is like the Rub Khali in the Sahara Desert, the part where nobody can really live. They're trying to leave there because Bisochim's spells are no longer making it a lush paradise. And as they were going along, they were attacked by goblins. That was pretty much where we left it, with Harrier trying to figure out how to defend against goblins and who knows what else, and Tercel and Bisochim trying to figure out what to do next. So we're going to be jumping back in and recapping Chapter 8 of The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And Chapter 8 is titled An Unlikely Alliance. We begin chapter 8 with Harrier waking up the morning after the goblin attack and looking around and kind of realizing that he's trying to make sure that everybody lived through the night. And he really is feeling very confused and conflicted, and we'll just let him tell us what he's thinking. He liked it better when he had still been able to hate them. Day by day, hour by hour, they had been turning into smaller and smaller groups in his mind. First, they had just been the Isvani army. Then, the army who had ridden out and the people who had stayed behind. Now they were just Leafa and Kirsha and Marinette and Sathan and Renurta and Hayden and 100 others, and some of them had ridden with Xanatar and some of them hadn't, and Harrier was ashamed because it no longer made any difference to him who had and who hadn't. They had all become people he had cared about. It made him feel as if he were being unfaithful to everyone who had died at Tarnatha Atreyu, in all of the Atreyu cities, but those people were dead and these people were still alive. He didn't know what to think. Not really. And I think that is where I really love the combination of Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory's writing, is that even in war, even in any sort of a conflict situation, it's really hard to hate people once you get to know them. Like, not impossible. I mean, trust me, there have been plenty of people that I'm like, no, I know you really well and I don't like you at all. But in general, if you get to know a group of people, it's really hard to hate them all. So when Harrier first heard about the Isvani tribesmen, they were just a faceless mass of people that he could hate because they were destroying all of the cities. And then he got to know the Nalzindar, and so then he was like, okay, there's the Nalzindar, they're good, and all the rest of the Isvani are bad. And then they got to the Lake of Fire, and he started getting to know the people that were in the bad group. And now he's discovering that they're just people. And I really like that. Like, I kind of almost wish that Tolkien would have written more from, like, the orcs' perspective or something. I don't always want to humanize the group that we're supposed to be fighting against, but I feel like a lot of understanding could be had if we actually did that. So Harrier is learning that the people he thought were enemies are just people. So Shariah and Sinarin come and see that Harrier is awake, and they try to make plans about what they're going to do now. Harrier thinks back to his lessons of his youth under his father and how, yeah, the Isvi people are not sailors. The Isvi desert is not the ocean, but that's all he knows, and he's got to figure out how to lead these people at least out of the Barreleth. And the only thing he can think of to do is at least to know that goblins don't like light, so he starts making cold fire and lighting up the desert so that they can still travel at night when the heat isn't going to kill them, but actually hopefully ward off goblins. And that is where we leave him. Well, we actually leave him thinking, Tercell's not back yet. and he hasn't sent help either. So he's feeling a little worried about Tercel, but also a little put out that he's trying to do all of this, and he was expecting Tercel back in a few hours, and it's been probably about a week or two at this point. They make it to the next well, and Harrier realizes that he senses something with his wild mage abilities. He tells everybody to wait there because he's going to go investigate. Sinarin and Shariah do not just wait there and ride out with him, and they see a lot of dust, like something either big or a lot of something is headed their way, and that is where we leave them staring out into the desert, watching something coming their way. We leave them and we rejoin Tercel and Saravase and Bisochim. And Tercel, for the first few days after Aniran's attack, was honestly too hot, too miserable. They've been traveling, but he doesn't know where they've been traveling. He's having nightmares, and he's pretty sure that these are just nightmares and not visions, because he keeps dreaming that Aniran is stalking around Tarnatha Atreyu, being followed by everyone Tercel has ever known, and they're all just sort of not alive anymore, and very obviously kind of zombies just following around the cities. And that's been distracting him enough that he doesn't want to sleep. And Saravase is in a lot of pain. Bisochim has bound up her broken wing as good as he can, but since he can't heal her, she's still absolutely miserable and irritable and very, very hungry. So Bisochim has been trying to tend to his dragon, about time. And they've been sort of traveling along, and, you know, a day, 2 days, 5 days, and Aniran hasn't shown back up. And Tercel is first pretty grateful that she hasn't come back to kill him, but then he starts thinking that maybe she's doing something very bad somewhere else. And then he realizes that it's been almost a Sen night, and they've been traveling every day or every night, and they must be going somewhere. And so he finally speaks to Bisochim and he says, "You know," Tercel said cautiously one morning, "I'm not an expert on elven magery, but maybe when we get through Palasha's Veil, the elven mages can think of a way to heal Saravase without getting tainted by Aniran." Saravase just snorts, and Bisochim turns and says, "We go back to the Lake of Fire. 10 days, no more, will see us at the edge of the Barileth. We must cross it in one night." "I shall not fail you in this, beloved," said Saravase. Wait, what, but we have to tell somebody, we have to get help," said Tercel. He had had little appetite for his breakfast that morning, and now he lost the tiny appetite that he had had entirely. "My madness and pride have already caused the death of thousands of those who I was charged to protect," said Bisochim. "To call water from the deep earth to quench the lake of fire, I fear I have once more set a desert in place of the garden. It might already be too late to save them." "But the storm wouldn't have," said Tercel, although he didn't think arguing would do any good. Not the storm, child, Saravase snapped. Or didn't you happen to notice the lake? There was a... This is one of those words that's going to get me. Tahuka Hia Has Ashariatel. Yeah. Love these words. Before, it was a large hollow mountain filled with liquid rock, she said, seeing Tercell's look of incomprehension. In other words, it was the caldera of a volcano. And Tercell is like, oh, I didn't know that was what was under the lake that was there. That explains why it was so hot. And then he wonders if maybe Harrier's already dead. You know, he's like, we just left, and Tercell really thought that everything there was going to stay fine. I guess he didn't notice that the grass was already dying even as they left, but this is Tercell we're talking about. And now we get a interesting little quote, because it is a story that Tercell is remembering from his childhood. And it does go a long way into kind of explaining how far the story of Kellen and Ankeldar and Germain has like mutated in the 1,000 and I guess it would be 9 years since the war. I do not know how we can journey to the far land where the sword of light lies, Kellen the poor orphan boy said. For Angriel the Black is the true son of the endarkened queen, and he has placed a curse upon my head that if my foot touches the ground within the lands of men once the sun has risen, then I will be turned to stone. And the magic unicorn Shulkin laughed, and his laugh was like silver bells. Only set yourself upon my back, Prince Kellen, and I shall run over land and sea, and we shall be in the land of elves before the sun shall rise, and the foul curse of Angriel the Black shall be broken. And Kellen, the poor orphan boy, had great wonder in his heart at the words of Shulkin the magic unicorn, and he did as he was commanded, and Shulkin began to run faster than the very wind itself. No wonder nobody actually knows anything about unicorns or dragons or anything anymore. But it does show that in 1,000 years, stories change a lot. And as I think Georgia pointed out, we don't really know things that happened 1,000 years ago. And we've had writing, so have they, but still. The Song of Kellen's Ride was a popular part of Kellen's story. It didn't make a good play, but there were countless songs and poems written about it. Some good, some bad, and the most famous, of course, was the one every child learned in the nursery with the chorus, "Run, Shulkin, run, the sun is at your heel, and you shall guide your rider through the depths of his ordeal." It seemed like a lifetime ago that Tercell had listened to Kerta and Ankeldar as they bickered about which of them was faster. And now it's Saravase's turn to run. And that is why he's thinking of the Song of Kellen's Ride, because he's trying to distract himself from the fact that when you're flying on a dragon, you know that you're going fast. You can see the ground moving below you, but it's far away, and perspective makes it seem not quite so fast. But when you're riding on the back of a dragon that's going as fast as it can go, I'm imagining it would be like being on top of a freight train, almost exactly like being on top of a freight train. The wind is whipping, the roaring in the ears, kind of, you can't really keep your eyes open because of the wind. And yeah, he's just sort of doing his best to hold on and not fall off. And then suddenly he hears Biso say, "Why is the desert filled with light?" Tercel didn't think it's possible, but Saravase actually kicks up the pace and starts going faster. And then Saravase lets them know that it's cold fire. Tercel is like, okay, if it's cold fire, it's gotta be Harrier, but why on earth is Harrier lighting up the desert so that Aniran could find them? Because it didn't seem to make any sense to him. Saravase begins slowing down and finally stops. And what are you doing here? A familiar voice demanded. Tercel blinked, shoving his now filthy chadar out of his eyes, and he looked down at Harrier and Shariah. "I journey to the Lake of Fire," said Biso. "Well, don't bother, there's nothing there," Harrier snapped. He tapped his Shotar on the shoulder. "All the fountains stopped working the day after you left, so we left." He comes over and Tercel gets down off of Saravase and he immediately falls over because his legs have gone numb from riding on basically a freight train. And Harrier comes over and just doesn't even offer to help him up, but just looks at him and says, "Tell me that you got to the Veiled Lands before whatever happened to Saravase happened to her. Tell me that's why you've been gone for so long. Tell me there's a good reason why Biso didn't heal her." "There's a good reason," said Tercel. He looked past Harrier's shoulder to the sky that was filled with cold fire. He couldn't imagine how long it had taken Harrier to make all of that. Why? She'll see you. We were attacked by goblins last night," Harrier answered. "They got all the livestock and 23 people. I'm sorry if the fact that I want to be able to see them when they come back annoys you." So they're kind of immediately fighting. Saravase lets Harrier know that they didn't make it to the elves and that they tried, but, obviously they didn't make it. Harrier asks why they didn't keep going to the elven lands. If you could run all the way back here, you could have run to the elves. And Tercel kind of loses his temper and is like, "Don't you see that she's hurt? Don't you care? I fell out of the sky and almost died." And Harrier says, "But you didn't die. You're alive. I told these people that help was coming, and it's not. You could have kept going. You could have gone to Arameth. You could have warned somebody. All you did was turn around and come back here. And why didn't Biso even heal his dragon?" "He can't," Tercel yelled, as loudly as Harrier had just yelled. "You can't. No one can. If you would..." And then he yelps because Saravase thrusts her head in between Harrier and him before they can start hitting each other. "If you would both stop shouting and start listening, I will explain," she said. Her explanation was quick and concise. Aniran's attack, the spell Aniran had cast upon her, Biso decision to return because he feared his magic had failed. "And so we're here," said Saravase. "Why did you leave?" Harrier gives her a look and then answers her. "Well, He's about to answer her. Shariah actually answers and says, the Isvani chose to leave Tenchitel because they had regained their senses and they knew that Bisuchim had fed them upon the bread of lies. And there was not safety there, because if an Iron went there for us, then we would have been trapped. And Harrier interjects that also the water in the wells had dried up, and who knows if the lake was going to be there, the next day. So we left. Bisochim finally speaks up and says, this can't be all the Isvani people that are left. And Harrier says, no, since I'm not an amazing dragon-bound wild mage, we had to split up into small enough groups to be able to use your stupid wells. Come on, let's go tell everyone that you're back. And so they all start to head back towards the Isvani people. Harrier is feeling really disappointed, and Tercel is feeling, honestly, probably fairly, he's feeling very hurt. I mean, Harrier hasn't even asked if he was okay. Granted, Harrier's been through a lot, but both boys have been through a lot. They're kind of not speaking very much, and Harrier goes on to just, he kind of ignores Tercel and heads towards the Isvani people to let them know that Bisochim's back and that they should probably pop their tents up because they're going to camp for the night. Bisochim turns to Tercel and he says, your friend has much anger in him. He sounded vaguely puzzled, just as if the last time he had seen Harrier hadn't also been issuing threats and demands. Yeah, well, he always did, said Tercel. Saravase asks if he thought this was like their idea of a fun time, and Tercel says, no, it's just Harrier never wanted to be here. I don't want to be here either, but he never had more of a choice than I did. And Saravase says that you should probably go talk to him. And now that you know we aren't going to the Lake of Fire, you need to decide what to do next. And Tercel's just like, yeah, I'll get right on that. And he heads towards where Harrier has gone off into the night, and he bumps into Sinarin and Shariah, who bring him into their tent and offer him at least a robe. They don't really have much in the way of clothing that they can give him right now because they don't have a lot of spares, but at least a cloak and some water. And then Harrier comes in to report on what everybody has said now that he's told them that Bisochim is back. And yeah, he comes in complaining that the Isvani, the leaders, are all arguing, and Xanatar is making speeches, and Leofa is just sitting there, but yeah, they're bickering. And he turns and he sees Tercel and he says, there you are. Why is there blood all over your robe? And Tercel says, because I fell out of the sky. And did you say Xanatar is here? Harrier grimaced. For the last 10 days, the Lazamar are one of the tribes in the group behind us. Xanatar decided to ride up and let me know that as soon as we get back to the Isvai, we're all going to go demon hunting. We are? Use your head, said Harrier. He dropped into a sitting position. If we don't hold all of the arrows in common, and parts of everything, and then he goes on kind of ignoring Tercel and trying to plan what to do as far as how to defend themselves against goblins, because he seems to have discovered that they're running out of arrows, which is their best defense against goblins. And Tercel is still kind of flabbergasted and still kind of annoyed that Harrier kind of talked right over him. And Tercel says, "If you hate these people, why are you trying to save them?" Harrier gave him a startled look. "I don't hate them. Most of them. Mostly they're just idiots. If you want to know why we're riding with them, hey, it's not like the three of us could exactly sneak out without anybody noticing after you left. And the grass was dead by noon, and..." "Okay, fine. You had a bunch of very good reasons to bring them all with you," said Tercel. "You weren't there," said Harrier. There was a note of warning in his voice now. "And now that you are here, we have to decide what to do." Tercel stifled another flare of resentment. He had gone with Bisochim. Both he and Harrier had thought Bisochim might be crazy, but they had been desperate. Harrier had expected him to be gone a day at most, and he had come back a fortnight later and said that he had been attacked by an Iron in person and that he had barely escaped with his life. He had said that he had to walk halfway across the Isvai, and all Harrier did was yell at him for not having walked to the Elven lands instead. Even now, Harrier hadn't said that he was glad that he had survived, or that he had been worried, or... But all Tercel says is, "Shouldn't we wait and plan with Bisochim?" And Harrier, who is feeling just as frustrated as Tercel is, says, "I don't know. I sent you to get help, and you didn't. Shut up," he said, when Tercel opened his mouth. "An Iron didn't kill you. She didn't taint you. She just set things up so that if Bisochim heals Saravase, he'll be tainted. So Saravase can't fly. But Bisochim can still use her magic. Nobody can live at the Lake of Fire. I had figured that an Iron had gone off somewhere. Light knows where. But last night we got attacked by goblins, and I think she sent them. And I also still think that you need to go get help, and Saravase is still the fastest way." Tercel tries to point out that they can't just leave all of the people out in the middle of the desert, but Harrier is not listening anymore because his night mage senses are tingling. It's kind of like Spidey senses, but more night magey. And he is like, "There isn't supposed to be anything in the sky right now." And he walks out of the tent spinning up balls of cold fire. Shariah follows Harrier, and she can see something too. And Tercel finally looks up, and he can see patches of stars winking out. So there is something very big in the sky. Harrier asks how big the thing that broke Saravase's wing was, and Tercel lets him know that it was as big as Saravase, and Bisochim called it a Balwarta. It looks like a giant Jari scorpion with wings. Harrier growled, deep in his throat, a sound of anger and hopelessness. "Sinarin, Bisochim is up the road. Go get him." Sinarin ran into the tent for weapons. Harrier poured the last of the water in his mug into the coals, extinguishing the cook fire. "Shariah." "The children and the dogs to the tents, fires and lanterns doused, and we must drive as many Shotars into the desert as we can. Maybe they're just hungry." So Shariah goes to alert everybody. Sinaran goes to get Saravase and Bisochim, and Harrier turns to Tercel and is like, get in the tent. Tercel protests that he can help, and Harrier says, you can't shoot a bow any more than I can, and nobody here will listen to you, so go inside. And Tercel resentfully goes inside while thinking, well, at least I didn't light up the whole camp like a demon banquet. And he heads inside, and then he thinks maybe he could at least, try to do something with all the lights. So he starts trying to gather up the lights because, cold fire is kind of like mage light. It keeps making him nauseous, and he's about to try to at least move the lights out of the way when he begins hearing screaming. Harrier had spent most of the last fortnight complaining about the Isvani, if only in the privacy of his own mind. Good for nothing, lazy, childish, unreasonable, argumentative, unrealistic, disorganized, indecisive, incompetent, and tonight he changed his mind. Because he looks up and he realizes that it's not just one, but two of these flying scorpion things. And the Isvani people are probably just as afraid as he is, but they're fighting or trying to. Harrier decides that he probably should yank all of his cold fire balls into a big ball of light so that, they can at least see what they're trying to attack. And he feels resistance on his balls of mage light. And so he's panicking that Aniran is there because that's the only thing he can think of that could make his magic resist him, not knowing that Tercel's on the other end trying to do the same thing. But that's our boys. But the Isvani people are trying their best to defend, and Harrier finally gets control of the light and looks up, and he sees the two Balwartas, flying scorpions. One was on the ground, standing in the middle of 3 or 4 smashed tents, and the air was hazy with smoke. Its clubbed, barbed tail was curved up and over its back. The other hovered in the air above it. The Isvani were shooting both. Once again, as when the goblins had attacked, some of the Isvani people were simply throwing themselves at the Balwarta as if they thought they were invulnerable, and that wasn't working out very well. But most of the other people are standing back and trying to shoot it with arrows, trying to maybe chuck a spear at it, anything that they can do. And Harrier knows that they can't really do much. He can see that these things are kind of armor plated, and yeah, he's thinking he's probably the only hope, so he calls fire. At the first touch of his spell, the Balwarta rose into the mass of cold fire that filled the sky. Now he couldn't see it, but that didn't matter. He had just long enough to worry that this wasn't going to work, to wonder when he had gotten the idea that setting living things on fire was a good idea, when it came falling back down through the canopy. It beat the naked veins of its burned wings as it fell, just as if it thought it could still fly. It hits the ground, and Harrier has a moment of hope, but then it flips itself over and takes off. And Harrier's trying to figure out how on earth he can kill the thing when Bisochim arrives and hits it with a bolt of lightning. Unfortunately, he hits it with a bolt of lightning right as Harrier was looking at it, so now Harrier is pretty much blind. And his night mage senses also let him know that there's another one. So there weren't just 2, there were 3. One is up high in the sky, and Thankfully, he does think of the Telchi, his teacher, who taught him how to fight blindfolded because he can't see a dang thing because he's still got the glare from Bisochim's lightning. Saravase comes and she attacks the one that was on the ground. Bisochim took out one with lightning, but there is still one up in the sky, and Harrier runs towards it, sensing it with his night mage gifts and bargaining fiercely with the wild magic as he goes. And then he realizes that he's there. He couldn't have described the feeling. It didn't go into words, at least not for him. He had never been good with words. He just knew because he knew, and there was no time to stop or hope or wonder if he was even right. He struck at the target with all the anger inside of him, the hatred for every senseless death, for every moment of cruelty and sacrifice and loss that had led him to stand here tonight and realize that it might not be today or tomorrow or even a se'nnight from now, but that he was going to end up dying trying to protect the people who had taken his teacher from him, who had taken his own life from him. Harrier wasn't even dead, and it seemed petty to resent that so much more than everything else that they had done, to resent anything on his own behalf when the stakes were so high, but he did. And he poured that rage into his spell until the energy that he had sent into it brought him to his knees. Harrier takes a couple minutes after dumping a lot of energy into a spell that even he doesn't know what spell he's using, when he hears the sound again. And at first he isn't sure what he's hearing, but then he realizes that they won. So he's kind of amazed, but just because they won that battle, it doesn't mean it's easy, because now they have to tally up their dead again. Shariah asks Harrier to help with the disposal of the dead, and this is where we see what the Isvi people do. Instead of, like, the elves hang their dead in trees, humans bury, centaurs just leave the dead in the fields to go back and become the grass in the next season. And the people of the desert remove all of the clothing from the dead and they lay them out in the sand. After that, they come back and try to figure out what they're going to do now. The leaders of the tribes that Harrier is traveling with are fighting over livestock and over what to do, and Harrier basically tells them that obviously if the time of breaking of tribes is here, you guys are all one tribe now, so you all have to share. Nobody really listens to him, but he does his best to make them listen, thinking all the while that maybe he is going back to thinking that they are all childish and irritating, so he leaves them to their arguing and goes to find Tercel. Tercel lets him know that it was him that was trying to grab the cold fire. They argue a little bit, but you can tell that the fact that they've been best friends for most of their lives is serving them in good stead. And Harrier listens to Tercel as they talk about what to do next. Tercel says, "Look, you know I read a lot about the last and darkened war, right?" They had reached the place where Harrier had decided to gather the Shotars together, and seeing all the other Shotars nearby, the one that they were leading, heads off to be with the rest of them. Yeah, I know I said I didn't care, Tercel, but that was back when I didn't think I was going to be fighting the next Endarkened war. And don't tell me that an Iron isn't an Endarkened, because trust me, this is not the time. Tercel shook his head. Aniran was an entirely different kind of demon, but he didn't want to start an argument about language with Harrier in the middle of explaining something important. It's just, yeah, okay, all right. The Endarken, they had a lot of what the histories called client races fighting for them, but they were pretty much creatures of the dark or cold, or the dark and cold. Dark as in, said Harrier, when the sun goes down? Yeah, it does that here every night, said Harrier. Yes, but it's also hot here, said Tercel. At least during the day, and the client races that used to fight for the demons were frost giants and ice trolls and cold wargs. So I don't think we are going to be facing anything like that. Don't you know? Said Harrier. No, said Tercel. There wasn't a lot in any of the books that I found. Sorry, said Harrier. I'm sorry. It's been a long night, and I think we're out of time. We need to decide what we're going to do. It was almost sunrise. The wind was rising, and the sky was shading from black to the darkest shade of blue. You want to decide right now? Said Tercel. He didn't want to complain, but he was exhausted, and he had been awake since yesterday, and he hadn't known what to do about an iron back then. No, said Harrier. Right now, I want to pretend that tonight never happened. They turned and began to walk back in the direction of the tents. You know, Harrier said, I used to think, back when we were on the road looking for the Lake of Fire, that everything would be so much easier for us if only we had an army just like Kellen and Germain did. And just look at us now. He gestured, and Tercel looked. All around them, the Isvai were rolling up carpets and making sure that cook fires were out and folding down their tents against the coming day. Yeah, said Tercel. There are times when I wish the light wasn't so hasty at granting wishes, said Harrier. And with still no real plans, that's where we leave it. It is really important, though, that Tercel, and I don't know if Harrier really got the point of it, because I know I didn't on my first read through. Because Harrier was worried about the fact that an iron is a demon and that, you know, that she's going to be throwing things at him. And Tercel makes a good point that, yeah, they're probably going to have to face the goblins, and obviously these flying scorpions, these Boltwartas, but it's not like they're going to be facing ice trolls or cold warg, which we know in the last trilogy were devastating, at least to the unicorn knights. So, you know, for better or for worse, we're going to be facing all new enemies, or at least mostly new enemies. Goblins aren't exactly new. But yeah, we've got the gang all together again, and still not really knowing what they're going to be doing, but at least it sounds like they're out of the Barreleth and heading somewhere. I don't even think they know where. But that is where we're going to leave it tonight. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that that you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time.